wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. With the immortal strain, angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away, wonderful story of love. Still he doth call today.
So, chapter 23, verse 33. Again, the Lord spoke to Moses. That is a recurring theme, not just through this book. Each chapter essentially has started that way, but also in this particular chapter, each one of these feasts starts that way. Point simply being that these were not things that were dreamt up by men. These days were given by God. So again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and there's a page turn, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, on the 15th of this 7th month is the Feast of Booths for 7 days to the Lord. On the first day is a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work of any kind. For 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall have a holy convocation, shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. It is an assembly. You shall do no laborious work. These are the appointed times, the Lord, which of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations. And that's just kind of wrapping up the end of the itemized list of these days. And so begins on the 15th day of the 7th month, last 7 days. The first day is called a holy convocation. Offerings by fire are presented for 7 days. The 8th day is also a holy convocation. The people are to rejoice before the Lord according to verse 40. They're to live in booths for 7 days. What is a booth? A temporary shelter. Well, they don't make it for Yom Kippur, they make it for this. Right. And they do use like palm leaves and stuff to make these things sometimes, but it is just a small temporary structure for them to dwell in. Why would he make them live in tents for 7 days? Because for 40 years they were in the wilderness. It is we talked about this at the end of class last time. All these things have some type of reminder to them. So what he says in verse 43, that your generations may know that I had the sons of Israel live in booths when I brought them out from the land of Egypt. For 40 years, they did not have permanent dwelling places. They didn't have a permanent dwelling place. Sometimes they moved every day. Sometimes they moved after some period of time, but they never were anywhere permanently. And he says, I want you to remember that. So then he gets into, from that point on to the end of the chapter, a summary. These are the appointed times of the Lord. He points that out again. Appointed carries with it the idea of what? Okay. That is told that there is a purpose involved. If you are to go to an appointed place, how is that different from going to a place? You're told to go to the appointed place, a specific thing. So these are the specific appointed times of the Lord. There are occasions for holy convocations, that is, assemblies, for offerings, for burnt offerings, for grain offerings, for sacrifices, and for drink offerings. They stand in addition to Sabbaths and to gifts and to vows and to free will offerings, which are something different altogether. Moses declared the appointed times to the sons of Israel, verse 44. He did what God told him to do. God has been telling him all along, I'm telling you this so that you can tell them. Verse 44 says, so Moses declared to the sons of Israel the appointed times of the Lord. So he did that. He proclaimed, these are the days that the Lord has given us. Now, very quick, we started off with the Sabbath. The Sabbath was every seventh day, which means every Saturday in our terminology. Passover was in the month of Nisan. That was their first month, in the 14th day. Now, when you talk about in terms of our calendar, there is not a direct correlation between the Hebrew calendar and our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one being they have a lunar calendar and we have a solar calendar, and ours actually shifts. There's not always a correlation from year to year of our days among our own calendar. Every 4 years, we get an extra day thrown into it. Why? Because we're missing a quarter of a day every year, and so we got to make up that day. So there's not a direct correlation, but it falls sometime in March or April. And so it depends on the year which one of those months this would be in, but that's the range. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is the 15th through the 21st. That's connected to the Passover. It starts the day after the Passover and runs for a week. Or, yeah, a week. I got to count my days. It also, therefore, falls in March or April. The first fruits is the day after the Sabbath during the unleavened bread. So there's a Sabbath in that week. The next day is the day of first fruits. So that's also March or April. Then you have what we call Pentecost, which is referred to here as the Feast of Weeks. Why is it called the Feast of Weeks? I'm sorry? And it's 50 days. It's 50 days after first fruits. And Pentecost it's directly called Pentecost in Greek because Penta has reference to 50. And so it falls somewhere in our May or June. Nothing else happens till the fall. So what you actually have is a group of connected spring festivals, our holy days, and then a group of connected fall days. The Feast of Trumpets is Tishri the first, which corresponds to our September or October. And then the Day of Atonement, our Yom Kippur, is Tishri 10th, which again, all these are September, October on our calendar. The Feast of Booths is Tishri the 15th through the 21st. And then the 8th day assembly falls on Tishri the 22nd. And so that is how these are set up. When you list them out individually, it sounds like there's all these days that we might think are spread out over the year. And that's kind of how we do holidays. We got one for just about every month. A couple of months we get two just for fun. Theirs were packed right there together and even connected to one another in some respects. Now there is some theological movement in the chapter that's worth looking at. The chapter moves through the year in a deliberate pattern. So it starts off talking about weekly rest. And then you remember redemption. and offer the first fruits. Then you celebrate the harvest, sound trumpets, you remember what atonement is all about, and then the deliverance is remembered and rejoiced in. That's the point of living in the booths. There is a connection between atonement and deliverance. Um, so that is somewhat important. It is getting them to think about their reliance upon God, their dependence upon God, and the fact that God provides for them both in this life and ultimately in the life to come. Um, and in all this, the Lord is claiming their time, their worship, their memory. I want you to remember these things. I want to make sure that you don't forget uh, their harvest and their future. All of those things belong to God. Did they always remember that? No, they did not. And they didn't even wait until today to not remember that. There were times that they got into difficult circumstances and they turned to their neighboring nations for help and deliverance instead of remembering what? That God owns their future. What should they have known? Even in the worst of situations, what should they have known? That Yeah, they were carried away into captivity a couple times. Jerusalem was destroyed a few times. But what should they have known despite that? Well, not just that God's in charge, but that they weren't going to go anywhere. We see a couple of times where that aspect of our faith and trust in God shines through. In Abraham's story, when he's told to kill Isaac, he knows at that point, or by that point, I should say, that even if he kills Isaac, that God would do whatever was necessary to make a great nation of him from Isaac, such that by the time we get to Hebrews and it talks about it, it says what? That he knew that God would even raise him from the dead if that's what was required. So this idea of no matter what happens, God has the future. And he's made some promises. And his promises can't fail. So no matter what happens, these things are still going to come to pass. Another situation with that is with the story of Ruth. And Mordecai has that faith. When he says to her, hey, you may have become queen specifically for this time so that you could deliver the people. But if you don't do it, God will raise up someone else to deliver them. Why did he say that? Well, because he believed in the future that God told him about, and therefore they could not be eradicated from the earth the way that the threat was being made. He said, look, we're going to be delivered one way or the other, but if God brought you to this day for this purpose and you don't do it, that's going to be a problem for you. But it's not going to be a problem for the nation, because if you fail to do what your responsibility is, God will raise up someone else to do it, because God has made a promise. He's going to see that promise through. And that takes a lot of faith to be able to look at these situations and these circumstances and to be in that kind of peril, and to realize, by the way, that that does not mean that I as an individual am going to survive. But at the same time say, doesn't matter, because God's promise is going to be carried through, and we will be delivered. And so that's important. That is a part of what all these things were supposed to do, is put before them what God had done for them so that they remember what God has promised to them. And they realize that all of these things, their time, their worship, their what they remember, their food, and their future, all was tied to God. And Does that have any application to us today? Anybody ever read Matthew chapter 6, somewhere around the mid-20s till verse 33? Remember what he said in verse 23? Seek ye first in his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. In other words, what he tells that whole section is you don't have to worry about certain things because God provides them. What you need to worry about is seeking God and his righteousness. And God will take care of the things that he has promised. It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. All right. Any questions about that chapter before we move on? This next chapter is an interesting chapter. It talks about the oil lamp in the tabernacle. It talks about the bread, sometimes referred to as the showbread, which makes an appearance later in the story with David and his people. And then that comes up in the teaching of Jesus. But he talks about the showbread in this chapter. And then he talks about some judgment and some other stuff against certain things. These things seem to not, they're kind of disjunct. We got this thing in the tabernacle, this lamp in the tabernacle. You need to keep it like this. We got this bread, and you need to keep that. And then, by the way, if this happens, this is what my judgment is. And you're like, well, what do those things have to do with one another? Well, keep that question in your head as we talk about it, and let's see if we can't determine what the continuity is in the chapter. Chapter 23, we just finished, established God's appointed times. Chapter 24 goes back to the tabernacle and to matters that must continue before the Lord from week to week and day to day. And so he starts off with this lampstand. You'll remember back, this goes all the way back to our study of Exodus when the tabernacle was first laid out, that the lampstand was in the tabernacle right near the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place. In fact, right on the other side of that veil was what? So the tabernacle sitting here, and then the veil, what's just on the other side of that veil, just behind it? The Ark of the Covenant. What was on top of the Ark of the Covenant? The mercy seat of God. So the place where God dwells and meets with the people is right beside the light. And what's he say about the light? Well, the Lord speaks to Moses. That's how this chapter starts, just like all the rest of them. The sons of Israel are to bring clear oil, or what does the other translation say? Pure. It's not the remnant stuff. It's the good stuff. And this is kind of important for us to realize when we read about oil lamps in the Bible. This is the oil we're talking about. Olive oil can be a fuel. There's enough energy in it. It's a fuel. And it was the fuel that they used for lamps. And in fact, olives surrounded their life quite a bit. Anyway, get this high quality olive oil, and you put it in the lamps, and you keep the lamps burning continually. Okay, what does that word mean? Okay, and nonstop or without stopping is one possible definition. Constantly is a synonym. You know what else is a synonym though? Regularly, which is a completely different idea than constantly. So the context has to define what it means. He then talks in verse 23 about where these lamps are, outside the veil of the testimony. But then he says this, looking at verse 3 very closely. Keep it in order from evening till morning, continually before the Lord. So did it burn 24 hours a day? No, it burned when the sun wasn't burning. They were required to, when the sun went down, when evening came, the lamp was lit and the lamp burned until morning. And the continually part of it is it was day after day after day after day. There was not a night that you let the lights go out. You kept the light up. God gave a light in the daytime. You kept the light burning at night. That the Hebrew word there is tamid, and it's used throughout the law for things that are regularly maintained. The emphasis is on their permanence and their consistency and the ongoing nature of the obligation rather than moment by moment activity. So during the night, each night, these lamps had to be built. Who took care of that, by the way? Not just the priest, but Aaron and his sons. They were the ones that took care of things inside the tabernacle. So Aaron's to keep the lamps on pure gold lampstands, verse 4 says, before the Lord continually. Before the Lord. How were they before the Lord? They were right there across the veil from the mercy seat where God chose to place his name. The light is not occasional. Now, when we studied about that, we talked about the nature of the language and the connection of this light to what? What is the light of God? Yeah. And Jesus is, according to John 1, what? The eternal Logos, the eternal Word. So he's the manifestation of the Word of God, the eternal Word of God, and they're obligated, and he's the light. And interestingly enough, when we read the New Testament, what are we to be? Lights to the world. We're supposed to receive his light and then do what? Shine it into the world. There's a connection between this lamp and all of those things. Yes, ma'am. Okay, sort of. They had there was a column of fire by night. Um, how bright that was, I don't know. It could be seen. There was light emitted. How much, I don't know. There's also a lesser night that governs the night, which is what? The moon. That goes all the way back to creation. This is something different. This is a light connected to the tabernacle of God, connected to the presence of God himself. And it was intended to, the tabernacle is always lighted. We are to dwell in the light as he himself is in the light. Dwell in the light. That is exactly what they're creating inside the tabernacle. Is a situation where everyone that's in the tabernacle is in the light. Yes, sir. I don't mind at all. It was not.
Think about this. God created light. And that's one thing he said, the first thing, one of the first things. Then you hear about a lesser light, about the moon. Light in that ancient world, not just the creation, but even in the time we're talking about now, and more significance than we can understand today, I believe. And for the spiritual concept of the light here, because we see that Jesus is the light of the world, and let your light shine later, hundreds of years later from this. The significance of light, from my experience and my reading in this, it has something to do with life. The light reflecting, this is just me now, this is not scripture, but the light, we know blood and light, but the light has some significance that I think a modern mind is hard to comprehend.
I would agree that we struggle with this concept, are the magnitude of the concept, in large part because we're never in the dark. And so when it talks about the outer darkness, when it's discussing being removed permanently from the presence of God, being in the outer darkness, we have trouble appreciating exactly what outer darkness means because we're never really in the darkness. One time in my life, well, probably more than once, but one time in particular that is burned into my head, I was in utter darkness. And it was in Carlsbad Caverns when they flipped the switch and turned the lights off. And it is pitch black. And our guide pulled a tiny little pin light. One of those things that Radio Shack used to sell on the, just a single battery controlling a tiny little bulb. And he lit that up. And that, by the way, that was before LEDs. This was a little tiny incandescent bulb. And and it was like the sun was shining from that tiny little light because it was so dark. And it was very comforting. The moment the light hit you, even though you still couldn't see anything, you could see a whole lot more than you could before. Yes, sir. They do that, yeah.
The one that was interesting was they turned up like one thing. Now they also have to say everybody can cover up all your watches
and phones and everything that's glowing.
But they get everybody to do that, and then the tour guide actually pulled out a candle, and she lit a like 3-inch long candle, right?
Like a birthday candle?
Yeah. And was like, and she was like, "This is one candle power of light." And it was amazing.
Yep.
Just the one candle.
Now, if you were needing to see details, that would not nearly be enough light. But again, the contrast between that little bit of light and no light is dramatic. With God, you are never in the dark. Yeah. Which is connected to this idea.
You don't remember the height from which you fall, and I will remove your lamp. To all the churches, that the thing he was going to do was take their lamp from them.
Take their light.
Their light is significant.
Romans 1 talks about people who, though they knew God, refused to acknowledge him as God, replaced the truth with a lie. And what does it say that he did? Anybody remember? He gave them over to their own desires. You know what that means? He quit sending them light.
How did he present himself to Moses? First time in a burning bush. Light has to do with fire, also purification, and the purity of fire brings light. Remember, the light we're talking about here is not electricity light. It's like the question said, a candle. That's a different type of light than the light we're looking at right now. But I didn't want to draw you off track.
Yep, no, that's okay. The next thing he talks about, but keep in mind, he's defining the perpetual characteristics of the tabernacle. It was always lighted. Then he talks about the bread of the presence. It starts around verse 5. Then you shall take fine flour, bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. He gives them a general recipe. 2/10 of an ephah of flour. He doesn't tell them exactly how much oil, but enough oil to do what? To make a cake of bread. He then tells them to arrange them. Not just tells them to arrange them, but how to arrange them. They're to be in 2 rows. There's to be 6 to a row, and you put it on the table before the Lord. You know what was right there beside the lampstand? The table for this bread. And what, before we go any further, what does bread represent? Life, sustenance. Listen, you cannot live without bread, and you cannot live without light. You know who provides bread and light? God. So that's the same thing as saying that God does what? Provides life. Now, if this room always had bread and always had light, then inside the tabernacle always had life. They are to put frankincense on each row as a memorial portion. When do we hear about frankincense? Okay, they brought it at Jesus' birth. It is a costly thing. Every Sabbath, the bread is set. Who's the bread of life? Let me just ask that question. Christ. That may have something to do with why he was brought frankincense. Every Sabbath, the bread is set in order before the Lord continually. Same language as the light. Now, how often was this bread set out? Every Sabbath. Continually. Again, this continually doesn't say that you were continually setting bread on the table. It was that there was a persistent, continual practice of putting this bread on the table and leaving it for a week. The bread is presented on behalf of the sons of Israel as an everlasting covenant. Verse 8. So there's a connection to the covenant between God and his children. And then it says in verse 9 something very interesting. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him from the Lord's offerings by fire, his portion forever. And so Aaron and his sons, the ones who were charged with tending to these things, when they put fresh bread out, took this week-old bread and ate it. And the significance of saying it has to be eaten in a holy place is what? They didn't take it home with them. They didn't carry it out and bring it when they went fishing or bring it out to the fields to have a snack or bring it home for their dinner. They stood there in the holy place and they ate that bread. Where do we get our sustenance from? Where do we get our bread from? God. Where do we get it? In his presence. I knew what you meant. It is most holy to him from the Lord's offerings by fire. This is a participation at this point. It is a communion between Aaron and God. This is part of the sacrifice of God. And they are now communing in that sacrifice. Why 12 loaves? Yeah, there's 12 tribes. So just as the lamp burns continually, there's bread continually. Then it gets weird. verse 10. Now the son of an Israelite woman, whose father was an Egyptian, went out among the sons of Israel. I'm going to stop there for just a moment. Why do we have an Israelite woman and an Egyptian man having a baby? It came with them out of Egypt. That they lived there for 400 years. So their son, it says, goes out among the sons of Israel, and a fight happens. The Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel struggle with each other in the camp. Now, I'm going to tell you immediately, this draws my attention back to another event. That's Moses, when he was among the Israelites. It just does. Now, there's something different about this one. The one who, and I hesitate to use the language, but the one who wins this struggle, who is it? The son of the Israelite woman blasphemed the name of the Lord and cursed, and they brought him to Moses. So we got this fight, and this blasphemy takes place. And he curses. And he's brought to Moses. And the mother is, I think, identified here. The daughter of Dabri of the tribe of Dan. I don't know if there's any significance to that information other than the fact that we are very clearly being told what? This is not just a story. This is actual events. This thing happened. There are specific people involved. His mother is identified here. The man is placed in custody. It says in verse 12, until when? Until the Lord's will be. They don't know what to do. So they're like, we're gonna keep him under arrest. They put him in jail until they knew what to do with him. And then the answer comes. Should I stop right now and give the answer next time? Or y'all want to take 2 minutes and finish this? Okay, they're still singing. Let's go. The Lord speaks to Moses in verse 13. That tells us that this judgment is not man's judgment. This wasn't Moses deciding he had a solution. God tells him the blasphemer is to be taken outside the camp. Those who heard him blaspheme are to lay their hands on his head, and the congregation is to do what? Stone him. So the Lord's judgment is then declared to Israel. Anyone who curses his God shall bear his sin. Verse 15. Anyone who blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. Verse 16. The whole congregation is to participate in the judgment. Verse 16. All the congregation shall certainly stone him, the alien as well as the native, when blasphemes the name, they shall be put to death. This applies to everyone, and everyone is involved in the judgment. Now, this is very different than the way justice is done by us today. We are so far removed from the process that very few of us even realize how the process works, much less when it works. But they were hands-on. And people say, well, it doesn't have any kind of deterrent effect. It does when you're that close to it. And when you see it and when you participate in it. The holiness of God's name is not limited to the priest. It's not limited to the sacrifice. It's not limited to the sanctuary. We just talked about the holiness and the nature of the sanctuary. It's not limited to that. His name has to be holy and has to be treated as something that is holy by every single person all the time. And if you don't, then you die. What happens today to someone who blasphemes the Lord? What happens? Well, maybe physically by other people, but what happens when I do that? I'm outside again. Now keep in mind, where's the light and where's the bread? In the tabernacle. But I'm not only am I not in the tabernacle, I'm not even in the camp. And I'm put to death. If we don't have the proper respect for God, proper respect for even his name, we don't have life. We don't have light. We are excluded from the people who have access to the blessings of God. And that is a significant thing that we need to be aware of. All right. Lord willing, we will pick up in verse 17 and continue with a discussion about justice under the law that becomes quite significant.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love.